What if a single, casual sentence could unravel decades of buried secrets? What if a ring, just a simple silver band, became the key to exposing a truth that no one was ever supposed to know? And what if that truth connected a lonely billionaire with a tired waitress in ways neither could have imagined? These are not just hypotheticals. This is exactly what happened one quiet night in a small-town diner when a young woman spoke without realizing she was unlocking a story of loss, love, and long-buried family ties. James Thornton wasn't just any man. To the world, he was a billionaire, his name etched on university walls and hospital wings, a man of wealth, power, and philanthropy. But sitting alone in the corner booth of Rosy's diner, James was stripped of all that. He wasn't the titan of industry tonight. He was just a grieving widower, a man haunted by ghosts he couldn't outrun. His wife, Claire, had been gone for 3 years now, killed in a car accident that tore his heart in half and left him wandering back roads, searching for places where money meant nothing and memories didn't follow him so loudly. Rosy's diner was one of those places. The coffee was bitter, the floors sticky, the wallpaper faded from decades of cigarette smoke and spilled grease. Truckers came and went, locals sat hunched over pie and gossip, and no one cared about the man in a tailored coat who sat silently with his cup. And maybe that's why James kept coming back. Here he wasn't Thornton the billionaire. He was just another tired soul hiding from life. Across the diner that night, Emily Harper was working a double shift. She was 28, a single mother, and a veteran whose army days were far behind her. Instead of patrols and discipline, her life was now a leaky apartment, overdue bills, and a toddler whose laughter was the only thing that kept her going. Her brown eyes carried exhaustion, her apron was stained with grease, but she kept moving with the quiet resilience of someone who'd had no choice but to survive. And around her neck, hanging from a thin chain, was the only piece of her late mother she still carried, a silver ring etched with a delicate ivy pattern. Her mother, Mary, had lost nearly everything to addiction, but she left Emily that ring, a relic of a love story long forgotten. James noticed Emily before she noticed him. She wasn't striking in the way magazines define beauty, but there was something honest about her face, something raw in the way she kept going, despite the weight she carried. It reminded James of Claire, of resilience, of love that endured even when the world tried to crush it. When Emily came over to refill his coffee, she glanced down at his hand. That's when she saw it. A ring. Not just any ring, but one that mirrored her mother's in every way. Without hesitation, she smiled faintly and said, "Hi, sir. My mother has a ring just like yours." The words were casual, tossed out in passing. But to James, they landed like a thunderclap. His heart froze. His hand tightened around the mug. His throat went dry. Because the ring on his finger wasn't just jewelry, it was Claire's ring, the twin to the one he'd given her when they were young, wild, and in love. A silver band with ivy etchings, symbols of a promise they once made to each other. James's voice came out low, almost a whisper. "What did you just say?" Emily blinked, caught off guard by his sudden intensity. "Your ring," she said, gently touching the chain at her neck where her own ring hung. "It's just like my mom's. She used to wear it all the time. Said it was from someone special." For a moment, James's world tilted. It couldn't be coincidence. Not the pattern, not the words, not the way it struck a chord so deep inside him that he almost couldn't breathe. "Your mother," he asked carefully, his voice trembling. "What was her name?" "Mary," Emily replied softly. "Mary Harper." The name was a dagger to his chest. Mary Harper, Claire's childhood best friend. The one who'd stood by them through their teenage years, the one who laughed the loudest, the one who faded away into addiction as life grew crueler. James hadn't thought of her in decades. He had locked her memory away, just as he'd locked away all the painful parts of Claire's past. But now here it was again, rising up like a ghost that refused to stay buried. That night, James didn't sleep. He sat in his hotel room staring at the silver ring on his finger, haunted by the name Mary Harper. Memories unspooled. A teenage summer when Claire, Mary, and he had been inseparable. He remembered the day of his wedding, when Mary hugged Claire and pressed a small box into her hand. Inside had been a silver band, the twin to Claire's. "So you'll always have me with you," Mary had said. A promise, a bond. But Mary's life had unraveled after that. Addiction, broken promises, years of silence. Claire had tried to help her, but Mary had slipped away until she disappeared completely. Claire blamed herself until the day she died. James had buried that part of the past with her. And now here was Mary's daughter. The next evening, James returned to Rosy's diner. He didn't know why, only that he had to see Emily again. She greeted him with a small smile, but he could see the question in her eyes. Why had this stranger suddenly become so interested? Over coffee, their conversation deepened. Emily spoke of her mother, how Mary had once been a singer with a voice that hushed rooms, how she'd tried to stay clean for Emily's sake but always fell back. How when Emily was just 16, she came home to find her mother gone for good. All that was left behind was the ring and a note that said, "I'm sorry, Em. Keep this safe." I have to pause here and add my own reflection. Isn't it striking how an object as small as a ring can carry generations of weight? We often think of wealth, cars, houses as the big things people leave behind. But in truth, it's always the small things. A letter, a photograph, a ring, that end up holding the deepest meaning. James listened as Emily spoke, his chest tight. And with every word, suspicion grew inside him. Because the timelines, the connections, the fragments of memory, it all pointed to something bigger, something terrifying. Could it be possible that Emily was more than just Mary's daughter? The ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry anymore. It was a thread, a clue, a key to a story that hadn't yet been told. And James knew, with a certainty that scared him, that this was just the beginning. James Thornton couldn't shake it. The ring, the name, the memories. It was as if the universe itself had thrown him back into a past he'd spent years trying to bury. For the next week, he found himself returning to Rosy's diner every evening. To anyone watching, he was just another regular. An older man with expensive clothes who nursed black coffee and occasionally smiled at the waitress with tired eyes. But inside, his chest was a storm. Every word Emily spoke, every detail about her mother, Mary Harper, only deepened the questions clawing at his mind. He learned that Emily had enlisted in the army at 18 to escape her mother's chaos, that she'd returned home years later with a daughter of her own, little Lily, whose curls and laughter could brighten the darkest day. He learned that Emily's mother had died young, her body finally surrendering after years of addiction. And he learned that Mary had spoken of Claire, sometimes fondly, sometimes with regret, as if Claire had been her anchor, her sister, and her judge all at once. One night, when the diner was almost empty, James leaned forward across the table. His voice trembled. "Emily, did your mother ever talk about me? Or about Claire Thornton?" Emily's eyes widened. "Claire? Yes. My mom used to talk about her. Said they grew up like sisters. She always got sad when she mentioned her. Said she let Claire down somehow. But you," she shook her head. "No, she never mentioned you." James pulled out his phone. His hands shook as he scrolled through old photos until he found it. A picture of Claire in her 20s, smiling brightly, the silver ivy ring glinting on her finger. He turned the screen toward Emily. "That's her," Emily whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's Claire. My mom always said she was the best person she'd ever known." For James, it was confirmation. Too much aligned to be coincidence. But still, questions gnawed at him. Questions he couldn't ask Emily. Not yet. So he did something he hadn't done in years. He hired a private investigator. Within days, the man returned with a file thick enough to make James's breath catch. In it were birth certificates, letters, fragments of records from a county office that had long since gathered dust. And in those pages was the truth. Emily Harper, born in 1997. Mother, Mary Harper. Father, officially listed as a drifter who'd long disappeared, but tucked deep in the file was something else. A letter. It was dated 1996, written by Mary, addressed to Claire. "I'm pregnant, Claire. It's his. I can't tell him. He belongs to you now. Please don't hate me. Please forgive me. James read the letter again and again, his chest constricting. Him. The letter was talking about him. Claire had known. His wife had known that her best friend was carrying his child. And instead of telling him, she had chosen silence. Chosen to protect him or to protect their marriage. Or maybe both. He would never know because Claire had taken that secret to her grave. Emily was his daughter. The truth slammed into him like a freight train. All those nights he'd sat alone in his mansion, thinking he had no family left. All those mornings waking up to silence, believing he had no reason to keep going. And all along his flesh and blood had been right here, serving him coffee in a small-town diner. But how do you tell someone that? How do you look into the eyes of a woman who has survived abandonment, grief, poverty, and pain, and say, "I'm the father you never knew you had"? When James finally returned to Rosy's that night, Emily was cleaning tables. She looked up, surprised to see him back so soon. "You okay?" she asked, sensing the heaviness in his face. James swallowed hard. "Emily, we need to talk." They sat in his booth. The neon light buzzed faintly above them, casting shadows across the rings glinting on the table. His on his hand, hers on her chain. And James told her everything. The truth about Claire, about Mary, about the letter, about how he had never known. How if he had, things would have been different. Emily sat frozen. Her hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You're saying," her voice broke, "you're saying you're my father?" James's throat closed. He could only nod. "I didn't know, Emily. I swear to you, I didn't know." Tears welled in her eyes. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the tile. "No," she whispered. "Number this can't be real." And before James could say another word, she walked out into the cold night. He didn't follow. He couldn't. Some truths needed space to breathe. Days passed, then weeks. Emily kept her job at the diner, but she avoided James. She took other sections, served other tables, gave him only the most formal of smiles. He kept coming anyway. Not to push her, not to beg, but to show her he wasn't leaving. Not this time. I have to pause here for a second, because this is where most men fail. Too often, when life drops a painful truth into someone's lap, they run, they retreat, they choose comfort over courage. But James stayed, and maybe that's the only reason this story didn't end in bitterness. One snowy evening, Emily finally approached his booth. She didn't sit. She simply held out the chain with her mother's ring, her voice trembling. "I've been thinking about Mom, about Claire, about you, and I'm angry. God, I'm angry at all of it. But," she paused, her eyes wet, "I don't want to be angry anymore. Lily deserves more than that." James looked up, hope flickering like a fragile flame. "What do you want, Emily?" "I want to know you," she said softly. "Not the billionaire, not the man on the magazine covers. Just you. And I want you to know Lily. She deserves a grandfather." The words broke him. Not because they were forgiveness. No, forgiveness would take time. But because they were an opening, a beginning, a chance. Over the months that followed, James and Emily began building something new. He met Lily, who barreled into his life with curls and laughter and crayons, who sat on his lap and asked him endless questions. He helped Emily with bills, not as charity, but as a father. She led him slowly, cautiously, piece by piece. They talked about Mary, about Claire, about the mistakes and the love that had shaped them both. James even funded a community center in Mary's name, a place where people fighting addiction could find support, so no daughter would ever have to lose her mother the way Emily had. Emily, in turn, began to dream again. She enrolled in night classes. She started planning for a life beyond the diner. And every step of the way, James was there. Not as the billionaire in the fancy coat, but as a father learning to be present, learning to love. A year later, Rosy's diner looked the same faded wallpaper, the same chipped mugs. But everything inside had changed. James sat in his old booth. But this time, he wasn't alone. Emily was across from him, Lily on her lap, coloring a house with a big tree out front. Their rings, his and Emily's, still glinted, symbols of a past that had hurt but had also healed. And for the first time in years, James felt peace, because here was the truth. The wealth he'd built, the empire he'd commanded, the grief he'd carried, they weren't the sum of his life. This was a daughter, a granddaughter, a second chance at family. As Lily giggled and Emily smiled softly, James knew Claire would have wanted this. Not a life of regret, but a life of redemption. Not silence, but love. And maybe that's the message we're all supposed to hear. That sometimes the greatest wealth isn't in what we build, but in who we find.